New immigration figures from the Bureau of Statistics show migrants from Asia now outnumber those from Europe and New Zealand. Many have been described by politicians and industry groups as filling jobs created by the resources boom. They're not. The figures prove that also. If you're in Brisbane, you might not yet have noticed the new Australia. In Sydney and Melbourne, you certainly have. Brian Seymour reports on the changing face of a nation.
I don't think facts lie. Australia's population is changing.
It's just natural. Come here. Easy to live here.
Australia is a country of migrants.
Multicultural Australia is now divided by race.
Sydney and Melbourne are diverging from the rest of Australia.
Immigration figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics show Asia has now overtaken Europe and New Zealand combined. But there's more. Almost all new Asian migrants are going to the same places. And it's splitting Australia in two.
Two Australias, because in Sydney about 40% of all adults are born overseas, and in Melbourne it's about just over 30%.
Dr. Robert Birrell runs the Centre for Urban and Population Research at Monash University. He's an authority on the subject and he's worried.
In the case of Sydney, by far the biggest single source of migrants in recent years is China. And in the case of Melbourne, it's now India. We're a nation that's now split.
And here's the trend to show it. Between July and December last year, 27,600 people arrived here from Asia, eclipsing the number from Europe and Oceania, which includes the UK and New Zealand, where traditionally most new Australians came from. And here's where they're going. 10,600 Asian settlers chose Sydney, 9,000 chose Melbourne. Look harder and you find Chinese migrants choose Sydney and Indian migrants like Melbourne.
It's remarkable how little controversy there's been about this fundamental change, really, to our population.
The reason, he says, we have low unemployment, so people aren't worried that migrants are taking their jobs. Instead, they're quietly changing our cultural makeup.
And it's often commented by people coming from regional areas into Melbourne and Sydney. They play the game of spot the Australian.
Did you know much about Australia before you came here?
We don't know anything about here.
Daniel Chong and his wife Josephine came here with baby boy Timothy last year. They are Chinese Malaysians, and they're doing what most Chinese and Asian migrants do when they arrive.
At first when we come here, our English is not very well. So we tend to join the group of people who talks our own language.
It is such an open society that everybody has done tail up, roll up your sleeve. Everybody is Mr. and Mrs. Average.
As president of the Australian Chinese Community Association in New South Wales, Lucilla Leong says new migrants aren't trying to become traditional true blue Aussies.
Do we have a strong policy of assimilation?
I don't think so. We have a strong policy of integration.
This grouping together means in some parts of Sydney and Melbourne, 65% of the adult population is overseas born.
We're still defining what is the Australian value.
Australian values. That's what this story is about. What are Australian values? Have they changed?
Have you heard of Don Bradman?
Don Bradman? Not quite sure.
Amanda Jiang and her friend Minnie Feng are both still Chinese citizens who now call Australia home.
Have you ever tried pavlova?
Pavlova? No. That's a type of food?
Yeah.
Now, before you condemn us as racist, consider Amanda has lived in Australia for 3 years, Minnie for 2 years. Should they know any of this stuff, or does it really not matter?
Do you know Waltzing Matilda?
Matilda? I heard of the name, but just can't remember.
So what does this all mean?
Do you think Australia will ever become an Asian country?
No, I don't think so.
Do you think we would have an Asian Prime Minister?
It would be good if we have.
Is Australia part of Asia?
No, we don't think so. But I don't know, in the future, yeah, it could become one of the Asian country too.
Australia?
Yes.
Do you think it will?
Depend on the government.
Well, under the Howard government, immigration has doubled to 165,000 per year and rising.
I don't see diversity in population as a threat in any way to Australia rather than an opportunity.
Mula Mesameri from the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council says migrants, especially those with skills, can only make Australia better and more prosperous.
Perth and Western Australia, because of the mining boom, are becoming another satellite, for economic prosperity. So I'm not really sure what Mr. Burrell is talking about.
The government argues that we need a high migration program because of the resources boom in Queensland and Western Australia, but the reality is that most migrants are actually going to Melbourne and Sydney.
While the British and the Kiwis prefer WA and Queensland, new Asian settlers are not going there, and they now outnumber our new traditional Anglo-centric settlers.
That's a dead aspiration. There's no way that we can sustain a high migration program over the next 20 years and not become increasingly Asianised, predominantly from the poorer Asian areas of mainland China and the subcontinent of India.
And ironically for the government, their immigration policy might prove their undoing.
Migrants from developing countries overwhelmingly vote Labor.
There are 750,000 more migrants living in Australia than there were in 2001. Per capita, Australia has the highest Asian-born population in the Western world.
If you look at the rainbow, I always say the rainbow, you have to look at the totality. But with a different colour there, you only make it brighter.
Some people delight in diversity and are quite happy to see Melbourne and Sydney transformed in this way. Others are anxious to maintain the old way of doing things, and if they like that prospect, then they should go to regional Australia or to Perth and southeast Queensland, because they'll find quite a different Australia.
Brian Seymour, our reporter, and there's more information on our website at yahoo7.com.au/todaytonight.